Hi everyone, it's Kevin from Creekview Solutions. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through setting up an orchestration using JD Edwards Orchestrator Studio. Specifically, I'm going to automate downloading the foreign currency exchange rates from the Bank of Canada and load it into JD Edwards. I think it's important to highlight the value proposition of Orchestrator and Orchestrator Studio. These are included as part of the technology stack, so there are no additional licenses required to use it. The solution we're going to put together today involves no customizations to JD Edwards and no coding. This means we are not incurring significant maintenance costs, nor are we dealing with custom code when we upgrade. Finally, assuming your organization updates foreign exchange rates on a daily basis, and that process takes someone 10 minutes per day, automating it would eliminate more than a week's worth of non-value added work over the course of a year. So if you're on a current release of JD Edwards, you should definitely consider taking advantage of something you already have licensed. If you're looking to upgrade, here's another justification to add to your business case. Before we dig into building the solution, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. I've been involved with JD Edwards since 2000 when the manufacturing company I was working for chose to implement it. Once we went live, I provided functional and technical support and eventually managed the team that looked after JD Edwards. For the past 8 years, I've worked as a JD Edwards consultant in a variety of roles including project management, functional consulting, and JD Edwards development. People often ask me which role I enjoy the most, and the honest answer is it doesn't matter. I often take on multiple roles in a project, and in the end, my definition of success is delivering for my client and leaving them happy. If I can help you implement, upgrade, or optimize JD Edwards in your organization, please do not hesitate to contact me. All right, let's get started. Orchestrations are a way to integrate JD Edwards with other systems and automate business processes. They are made up of different types of steps, including whitelists, rules, cross-references, and service requests. For this demonstration, we're going to focus on two types of service requests. Connectors, which allow us to connect to external systems, databases, FTP sites, or other orchestrations, and form requests, which allow us to manipulate data in JD Edwards using interactive applications as if we were doing the work directly in the screens. When designing an orchestration, it's important to look at the overall process requirements and how each step fits in. For this example, my orchestration will have two steps. First, I'm going to use a connector to request the exchange rate from the Bank of Canada. Second, I'm going to use a form request to enter that new rate into JD Edwards. So let's get started with the Bank of Canada connection. The Bank of Canada offers a free open REST API for accessing their exchange rate information. The documentation for the API is available online for you to review. Before we go any further, let's deal with the acronyms. API stands for Application Programming Interface. This is what the bank has provided to allow us to request and receive the data that we're looking for. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. REST is an architectural approach of how an API is designed. REST interfaces are designed to be accessed via a URL in the same way that a web page is accessed. In fact, I'm going to use my web browser to access the API and make sure that I know the URL and parameters needed to get the data that we want. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. This is the text file format that's often used for moving data between systems on the web, and this is going to be the format of the file that we're going to receive back from the bank. Before we create our service request connector, we need to determine the URL of our request along with any parameters that will provide the exchange rate we want. We start with the base URL, which is the same for all calls to the Bank of Canada's Valet API. Then we need to add observations, the series names, and please note this is what determines the from and to currencies in our exchange rate, and the type of file that we want to get back. I also need to add in a parameter that will limit the observations to the most recent one, and when we put it all together, this is the request that we need to send. Let's submit this request using a browser and see what we get back. Alright, so the bank has sent us back a JSON file, and if we open that up and take a look at the raw data, you can see that we have an exchange rate for US dollars to Canadian dollars. So we have the data that we need to put into JD Edwards. The next thing we need to do is figure out how to map that out of this file. I'm not going to try and cover the JSON file format in any detail, but I do want to explain how we get the value we need out of this file so we can use it in our service request. The curly brackets indicate the start and end of objects in the file. The square brackets indicate the start and end of arrays in the file. An array is a list, in this case a list of observation objects, and we can access any specific observation object in the array by referencing its ordinal position. Don't forget the first position starts at 0. You can nest objects inside of other objects. For example, each observation object has an FX CAD object inside of it, and that object has a property called V that holds the exchange rate value. In this example, I use 5 observations to make the array a little more obvious, but when we set up our request, we're only going to get 1 observation back in the array. Even though there's only 1 object coming back, we still need to reference it in its ordinal position in order to map it into the service request. All right, let's go get this set up in Orchestrator Studio. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is create a connection to the Bank of Canada website. And to do that, we'll start by clicking on Tools, Connections, and New Connection. And now we'll complete the information required. So I'm going to need to call a name for this. So I'm going to call this CBS underscore bank underscore of underscore CA. And the description is going to be Bank of Canada Valet API. We're going to change this to an external REST type of connection. And this is where you'd put a role in normally that you would use for determining who can actually work with this particular connection. So in this case, I'm going to just put in JDE, and for the environment, I'm going to put in the pristine environment. So JPS 920. For my endpoint, I'm going to use the base URL that we found on the Bank of Canada website. So https://bankofcanada.ca/valet, and then I just click the save button, and we have our connection. All right, now that we've got our connection set up to the Bank of Canada, we need to create a connector service request. So let's go Service Requests, Create Service Request, and choose Connector. Now we'll put in the name of our service request. And a short description. Now we select our connection, and we'll select the one we just created. And this is going to give us a connection to our base URL. So then from there, we need to add in the rest of the path to get the information that we're looking for. So if we go under pathing, then we can just start typing in observations. And then we put in our series. And finally, our file format. And if you recall from the slides, we added in a parameter that only gave us back our most recent observation. So instead of putting the question mark recent equals 1 in there, we'll just put in the parameter name and the value that we want to send in. And if we click test, you'll see that we're getting our JSON file back with our foreign exchange rate in it, which is great. Now, it's a little bit limited in the way we've got this set up right now because we are currently hard coding in our series. So that meant if we had other conversions that we want to do between different currencies, we'd have to hard code those as well. And there's actually a better way to do this, so we only have to set this up once and use it for whatever currency combinations we want. And that is to replace this portion of it with a couple of variables. So to create a variable, the syntax in this area is to go $, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and in the middle of that, you would put in the variable name. So I'm going to do that for from currency and to currency. So now what's going to happen when I click on test, it's going to prompt me for those two values, and I'll use 0 this time, the Canadian dollar, and click on execute. And if we go down and look here at our JSON file, we can see that we're now getting the euro to Canadian dollar exchange rate. So that solves that problem. Now the next thing we need to address is how do we get this value out of the JSON file? And we do that by going to the output section, and we need to map this value into this output and then put in a variable name here to hold it. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in observations. And of course this is in a array, so you use the square brackets and it's the first value in the array. So we'll just say it's 0. And then what we need to do is we need to put in the same value for the series as we did in the pathing section. So I'm going to go up here and actually just copy this. And then .v for the actual value that we want to get. And the variable name that we're going to hold this in is exchange rate. And that's all we need to do. So let's save that, and we're good to move on. All right, now I'm going to create our form request. So first thing I'm going to do is turn on the process recorder. So I'm going to click on record a process, and then click on start to start recording a process, and then I'm going to launch our rate entry screen. So we'll go and click add, type in the from currency, the to currency. We're going to use the no inverse method, and we're going to put in a multiplier rate. So I'll put in there, click OK to save, click close to close the application. Now that I've closed the application, it's going to prompt me for a name. And there we go. Now we want to clean this recording up a little bit, because right now there's some information in that form request that we want to clean up. So let's just go into and edit our form request. So I'm just going to click on the one that we just created using the recorder and go into this request. Now when you're looking at a form request in Orchestrator Studio, the way that it's laid out is the grid down at the bottom here will reflect each of the screens, and the grid at the top will reflect the actions that are happening in each of the forms. So when we first launched it, we went to the work with currency exchange rate and we clicked the add button. So the only action that we did on that form was to add it. Then we went into the revised currency exchange rates, and that's where we put in our information. And then when we came out, we hit the close button, which was the last thing there. Now, the only thing I wanted to go through and revise is in our revision currency exchange rates, I want to take out some of these defaults. So I don't want to default in the rate or the currency, because if somebody doesn't plug it in, it's not going to do me any good. And I'm going to change the variable names a little bit so they're consistent with everything else that we're doing. And they are a little more legible. So basically all I've done is just a little bit of cleanup here. I'm going to default the conversion method to BY, and otherwise you'll need to put in the rest of the information, the from currency code, the to currency code, and the exchange rate, or else you won't be able to actually create an entry into the rate form. So now I'm going to save this, and there we have our form request. Okay, now that we've got our two service requests set up, the next step is to actually add them to an orchestration. So let's add this, create an orchestration. So we'll say new orchestration, and we'll give our orchestration a name. And a short description. Now what we're going to do is add steps to our orchestration. So we're going to click on this little plus sign, and what type of step do we want to create? And we're going to say a service request. Click on this little plus sign. That's going to add it to our orchestration steps. Now, the first thing we need to do is click on this little button and select the actual service request that we want to put on there. So the first thing we want to do is get the Bank of Canada foreign exchange rate. So we're going to call that. And we add that in. We've got a few more buttons here to take a quick look at. So this is the edit button. So if I need to go in and change this service request, I can drill into it right from here and make a change. This button takes the inputs from my service requests and adds them to my orchestration. So right now, if you look, there's no orchestration inputs set up. So when I call this orchestration, there's no inputs that are going to be allowed to be passed into this orchestration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this button, and what it's going to do is it's going to take the two inputs from my service request, from currency and to currency, and add them to my orchestration input. So when I call this orchestration, I can pass in the currencies that I want. And then what I need to do is I need to map those variables from the orchestration input into my actual service request. Just like that. All right, so then the next thing I need to do is add in my second service request, which is my form request. So I'm going to click on the existing service request so that it turns blue. And then I have two buttons here. So this button allows me to insert a step before this service request, so on top of it. And this one allows me to do it afterwards. So this is the next step. So we're going to do this afterwards. And again, we're going to choose the type. It's going to be service request. Click the plus. Then we're going to choose the form request. So now all we need to do is map the variables that are going into the form request. So these are the values that are going to go into JD Edwards from our Bank of Canada. So what we're going to do is pick our from currency, our to currency. I'm going to leave the current conversion method blank because I want that to default from the service request. Remember, I left that as a Y, so it's a multiplier. I'm going to map in the exchange rate, and this exchange rate is the variable that we created in the first service request when we get it from the Bank of Canada. And I'm going to leave the version blank because at this point I don't need to use anything other than the standard JDE default version. And that's basically it. I will save this, and our next step will be to test it. So let's test out our orchestration that we've just built. So if we're in JD Edwards, we can look and see that I've got a filter on here for exchange rates effective in 2019. And if I hit find, you can see that I don't have any exchange rates in there. So let's switch over now to the Orchestrator client. And the Orchestrator client allows us to test orchestrations and to run orchestrations interactively. So all you have to do is click on the orchestration that you want to run, and then you can fill in the values. So the from currency to currency are the two values that we said we wanted to input into our orchestration when we ran it. You can also paste in, if I click this JSON input button, you can paste in a JSON file to be able to run the input that way. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to put the two currency values in there. So from currency to currency, and we're going to click run. And in the input section, what it's done is it's actually formatted our inputs into a JSON format so that it could get passed into the orchestration. And then the output is the information that came back from the orchestration. So the first service request had our exchange rate, and then the second service request is all the outputs coming back from the P0015A. So no errors anywhere in here. So if we go back to our exchange rate screen and we hit find again, as you can see now we have our exchange rate loaded into JD Edwards. So this is working for us. Okay, so even though we've got an orchestration that works and successfully takes the bank foreign exchange rate from the Bank of Canada and loads it into JD Edwards, we're not quite finished yet because we still need to be able to handle more than one currency because we're passing in the from and to currency into our current orchestration. And we also want to be able to schedule this so that we don't have to have somebody looking at this unless something goes wrong with it. So in order to be able to do that, we have one more orchestration to create, and that's going to be the one that's actually going to drive the overall process. And what it's going to do is each step of that orchestration is going to call the original orchestration and pass in different currency values to update those rates inside of JD Edwards. So in order to be able to call the orchestration, we first need to be able to create a connector service request that will allow us to call that particular orchestration. So we're going to go in here, and we're going to create a connector, and we'll give it a name. And then we're going to tie it to our orchestration. And it automatically picks up the orchestration input variables and creates them for us here in our service request. So all we have to do is save this. And we're ready to go on to our orchestration. Okay, so this is our last step in creating this overall process. We need to create an orchestration that's going to do the update of all the foreign exchange rates that we have in our system. So we're going to go into Orchestrations, New Orchestration, give this a name, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add an orchestration step for each currency combination that we want this process to update. So first of all, we just add in a service request. And that service request is going to be the one that's going to call the other orchestrations. So this is the one we just created. And we're not going to create any orchestration inputs for this orchestration. We don't need any for this. What we're going to do here, we're not going to map any values in, but what we are going to do is we're going to provide default values. So in this case, we're going to say the from currency is USD and the to currency is CAD. So what's going to happen is when this step of the orchestration runs, because there's no values mapped in here, it will use these default values and pass them into the orchestration, and that's going to go out and process our US to Canadian dollar exchange rate. I can then go and add another service request with the same connector service request and put in a different set of currency values. And so on and so on. So I can add in as many currency combinations as I want, and what it will do is when we call this particular orchestration, it's going to go through each one of these steps and call the other orchestration with the default values that we put in here. So if I have another exchange rate that I need to add in at some point in the future, I just come back into this orchestration, add another step on to this orchestration and add in another currency. If I stop working in a currency and I want to take that out, I can simply delete the line out of here and take that currency out of the process. So I'm going to save this. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add this to a scheduler so that this process will run automatically without any intervention. So we go here. I have some schedules already set up, and I'm just going to say this is going to run weekdays at 8 a.m. So now I've got this on a scheduler. It's going to run weekdays at 8 a.m. and I save it. And that's it. We've got a process that's going to go out. In this particular case, it's going to pick up updated foreign exchange rates for US to Canadian dollars and euros to Canadian dollars, and update JD Edwards without any human intervention. So let's recap the solution that we just built. We started with creating a connection to the Bank of Canada Valet API. Next, we created a connector service request that downloaded the most recent rate for the to and from currencies that we passed in. We also created a form request that loaded the rate into JD Edwards. Then we created an orchestration that received the from and to currencies as inputs and executed the two service requests. We created one more connector service request that called the add new rate orchestration. Finally, we created the update all foreign exchange rate orchestration that has a step to call the add new rate orchestration for each combination of currencies that's required. Then we added that to the scheduler so it runs every weekday at 8 a.m. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you found it helpful, please feel free to like and share it with others. If you have any questions or comments regarding the material in this video, or if you need help implementing, upgrading, or optimizing JD Edwards, please feel free to contact me at kevin.long@creekview.ca or connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your time.